Welcome to this explainer. There are some names in history where you just kind of assume the book is already closed, right? Like we hear the name Leonardo da Vinci today and we immediately stamp the word genius right across his forehead. But if we actually rewind the clock, a really fascinating mystery starts to emerge. While history thinks it knows everything there is to know about da Vinci, we're actually going to look at his legendary genius from a completely different angle today. We're going to look at how his entire life was actually defined by the things that were missing. Okay, let's dive into this. It is literally the central paradox of his entire existence. How did a life defined by incompleteness forge history's absolute greatest genius? I mean, when you look at his birth, his education, his work, his dreams, there is this constant recurring theme of things just being left undone. But what we're going to uncover today is that his unfinished projects and his severe lack of a formal education were absolutely not weaknesses. They were, without a doubt, his greatest superpowers. Section 1. The mystery of incompleteness. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to go back to day one, because from the very beginning, Leonardo's story was just not normal. The very circumstances of his birth put him on a total collision course with the rules of his era. So April 15, 1452, in a tiny Italian village called Enciano, Leonardo is born. But he was born out of wedlock. His dad, Ser Piero, was this highly respected notary in Florence, a big deal. But his mom, Caterina, her origins are actually a complete mystery. Even today, historians are fiercely debating whether she was a local peasant or, as some newer research suggests, someone from a slave background. But whatever the actual truth is, this birth status immediately sidelined Leonardo from society's mainstream. He simply wasn't allowed to follow the comfortable, respectable path that his father had walked. Section 2. The Unlettered Observer. Now, what's really interesting about this is how that early separation completely upended his education. Because he was illegitimate, the doors to a traditional classical schooling were just firmly locked shut. Back in the 15th century, the expectation of a true scholar was incredibly rigid. If you wanted to be taken seriously, you learned Latin, you learned Greek, you sat and read Aristotle and Plato in their original texts, and you basically just deferred to ancient authors for all your answers. But Leonardo's reality was entirely different. His formal education was incredibly basic. We're talking standard reading, writing, and some really simple math. At the time, society saw this as a massive deficiency. But think about it for a second. If Leonardo had learned Latin, he might have just absorbed the exact same accepted facts as every other scholar. If he had spent his youth reading ancient texts, he probably would have just learned to think exactly like everyone else. But instead, Leonardo totally owned this perceived flaw. He actually went around calling himself an homo senza lettere, which translates to an unlettered man. And this is crucial. This wasn't a complaint. He wasn't throwing a pity party. This was a bold, in-your-face declaration of independence. He was publicly stating, hey, I am not bound by your ancient texts, and I certainly don't bow down to the authority of dusty old books. Since he couldn't just look up the answers in a library, he had to look around him. And he developed what the establishment would probably call a very dangerous learning process. It was simple. First, observe. Second, question. Third, believe. He basically decided that if he hadn't seen it with his own two eyes, he just wouldn't accept it as truth. Nature became his school. He would spend hours just watching how water swirls in a stream, dissecting how birds actually manage to fly, wondering why the wind never stops, and noticing that tree branches grow in these identical, repeating mathematical patterns. He didn't just look at the world, he relentlessly interrogated it. Section 3, a lab of making. Now, a unique, restless mindset like that needs a very specific environment to actually thrive. And his introduction to the working world gave him exactly what he needed. He didn't go off to a stiff university. He went somewhere way better suited for a curious kid. At roughly 14 years old, young Leonardo arrives in the bustling, hyper-competitive city of Florence, and he lands an apprenticeship in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Verrocchio's workshop was definitely not just some quiet room where you sat politely and painted landscapes. Oh no, it was this chaotic, brilliant making lab. This is where Leonardo got his hands dirty. He learned the heavy-duty art of metal casting. He learned the complex chemistry required to mix vibrant colors. He worked with wood, studied mechanics, and explored the incredibly precise intersection of drawing and engineering. This environment was an absolute game changer for him because it taught him to completely blur the lines between art and science. To Leonardo, figuring out the mechanics of a gear was just as beautiful and just as necessary as sketching a human face. Section 4. The Unfinished Artist. And this brilliantly illustrates where his most famous and maybe most frustrating criticism actually comes from. As he grew into a master, his process became so intensely focused on the thrill of discovery that the actual finished product, it became kind of secondary. Just track his early career in Florence for a second. In 1472, he joins the prestigious St. Luke Guild. Great. In 1473, he creates this stunning Arno Valley landscape drawing. But then, look at what happens with his major independent commissions. 1478, his first big independent commission left entirely unfinished. 1481, he gets the highly prestigious Adoration of the Magi gig, and yep, also left completely unfinished. This was not a fluke. It was a clear pattern. His major works kept ending up incomplete simply because his mind was just way too restless to stay put. Naturally, people in Florence started to whisper. You can imagine the gossip. This guy thinks too much, he's unreliable. But the truth is, his habit of leaving things undone wasn't born out of laziness. Not even close. He was working to understand, not just to finish. Once his brain figured out the core mechanics or the complex emotional geometry of whatever he was working on, he just lost interest in literally watching paint dry. He had already solved the puzzle in his mind, so why bother with the tedious execution part? He valued the raw process of understanding infinitely more than he valued the applause for a finished product. Section 5. The Milan Pivot. Eventually, though, that mindset created a lot of friction in Florence. Feeling suffocated by the intense, cutthroat artistic competition and, frankly, struggling with a severe lack of cash because he wouldn't finish his commissions, Leonardo makes a massive, drastic pivot. He packs up and looks toward Milan. He actually writes this legendary job application letter to the ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. And listen to what he pitches. War machines, portable bridges, forts, advanced weapons, hardcore engineering solutions. Notice anything conspicuously missing from this list made by one of history's greatest artists? Yeah, painting. There is almost zero mention of art. He basically pitched himself as a full-blown military engineer and inventor. Leonardo had realized a very harsh practical truth. Talent alone doesn't feed you. Work does. And this brilliant strategic pivot gave him exactly what he was starving for, nearly 17 years of actual stability in Milan. He was finally on a steady payroll. That gave his hyperactive mind the freedom and the financial safety net to just explore. And it was exactly during this stable, protected period that he created what is arguably his ultimate masterpiece, The Last Supper. But come on, it's Leonardo. Even with his most famous masterpiece, he couldn't resist his own nature. The Last Supper was, at its absolute core, a giant science experiment. Instead of using the traditional proven method of fresco painting, which we know works, Leonardo decided to experiment with this totally untested new tempera and oil mix on a drywall. The result? The painting began rapidly deteriorating and flaking off almost as soon as he finished it. The locals were probably horrified, but Leonardo? He wasn't. He was just experimenting. Once again, he proved that he valued the thrill of discovery and breaking new ground way more than he cared about adhering to safe, boring traditions. Unfortunately, that sweet stability in Milan didn't last forever. In the year 1499, the French army rolls in and attacks Milan. His wealthy patron, Sforza, falls from power, and just like that, Leonardo is abruptly forced to abandon his workshop, his steady income, and everything he had built. He had to pack up and start all over again. So the crucial point is that his flight from Milan wasn't some tragic defeat. In a way, it completely solidified his legacy. Leonardo was no longer just an artist or an engineer or an inventor. He had literally become a living question. He was a man totally unbound by the dusty books of the past. His very existence challenged the strict rules, the boundaries, and the accepted traditional knowledge of the 15th century. His incompleteness, that constant searching, that refusal to just finish a painting and conform, is exactly what kept him learning and seeing the world in a way literally no one else could. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from Leonardo's extraordinary, messy, beautiful life. He started with an incomplete education, he left countless masterpieces unfinished, and he flat out refused to be bound by the classical rules of his era. And it was through that very incompleteness that he unlocked absolute genius. So I want to leave you with this thought. Leonardo refused to be bound by the rules of his time. What rules are you letting bind your thinking today? Maybe it's time to embrace your own incompleteness, look a little closer at the world around you, and honestly, never stop questioning. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.